FDA and ICH guidelines and regulations require an audit trail. And an audit trail is simply a listing of anybody who created, entered, or modified data in a database, whether that is originally from a paper case report form or through an EDC system. Audit trails have to say who made the change, when it happened, and what the change was. So here's an example of the audit trail that we have in REDCap, and this is essentially how I do a lot of the grading on your assignments. I go into the audit trail and I look to see what you created and what you did at what point. The data review plan is really your primary document for how you're going to clean the data in a trial. We can define the scope of data review by aligning with risk-based monitoring objectives, the analysis plan, and the scope of work. I've created a simple data review plan for our trial, which I've stored in the data management study file. Notice I've got version control up here. In general, when writing a data review plan, you want to focus on the critical data or key variables. You're going to be looking for trends and patterns in the data, and you always want to look for opportunities to proactively identify the root cause of data errors so that you can reduce future errors. Let's talk a little more about version control. First, version control is hard, but it's important. Imagine what would happen if each team member was working from a different version of the data review plan. The result would be inconsistency and, frankly, chaos. We avoid this by adding text to each document that identifies what version it is. The version number should appear on every page of the document. For our mock trial, I put the version number in the header along with the date. Some companies like to put the version number at the bottom of each page, just to make sure you have it on every page. Here are a few examples of various approaches to documenting version number. You can see some are in the header, some in the footer, some include the date, some don't. Once you have each version identified, you need to make sure you distribute the new version to every team member and collect all copies of the superseded versions. Again, this is harder than it sounds, but it's important. Some companies go so far as to prohibit printing of hard copies of project documents. That allows them to ensure only the newest version is available online. But you need to keep at least one copy of the old version and archive it as part of your overall study documentation. Again, I know I say this a lot, but make sure you know what the SOPs for version control are for the company where you're working. I want to start by describing the difference between the data management study file and the trial master file. You'll discuss the trial master file in depth in your monitoring class. Essentially, it's a file that contains all the clinical and regulatory documents pertaining to the conduct of the study. The data management study file contains only those documents relevant to data management. It's considered a best practice for data management groups to establish and maintain a data management study file. There's no regulatory requirement for this, but the industry expectation is that the common documents we've discussed will be maintained in this file. At the end of the study, the contents of the data management study file may often be transferred to the trial master file. We'll be building our own simple data management study file as we work through our mock trial. I'll be creating a tab on Blackboard titled CLR Mock 001 Data Management Study File. As we work through each module, I'll upload the relevant documents that we use and create. In your textbook, Chapter 5, Preparing to Receive Data, Proska lists some common study startup tasks for both paper-based and EDC studies. Proska correctly points out that you have more time for setup activities in paper-based trials. When you're using a paper CRF, the database doesn't have to be operational at the same time that the patients begin enrollment. The sites can enroll patients and record data on the paper CRF, and that CRF can be stored until the database is released for entry. But with EDC trials, the database really needs to be up and usable by the time the first patient's enrolled. The takeaway here is that in EDC trials, you can't count on lag time between the start of enrollment and the release of the database. The database needs to be ready when the patients are enrolling. Proska also has a nice discussion in the text of basic setup activities for EDC and paper trials. I've listed some of the highlights on this slide. Here's one of those concepts I'm going to repeat throughout the course. The entry instructions need to be in place before the database is open for entry. let's talk about validation, verification, and user testing, because these terms and concepts tend to be confused. It's important that you understand the difference between validation, verification, and end-user testing. According to the IEEE Standard Glossary of Software Engineering Terminology, validation is the process of evaluating a system or component during or at the end of the development process to determine whether it satisfies specified requirements. So validation demonstrates that the system is operational and that the software conforms to the requirements that were defined at the beginning of the software development lifecycle. Did we build the thing right? Verification, on the other hand, is the process of evaluating a system or component to determine whether the products of a given development phase satisfy the conditions imposed at the start of that phase. So, in other words, verification is proving that your output conforms to your input. Did we build the thing right? User acceptance testing, or UAT, is the last phase of the software testing process. During UAT, actual software users, like data entry people, test the software to make sure it can handle required tasks in real-world scenarios according to specifications. So UAT is the final, typically, procedure done before you release a new software. It's also known as beta testing, application testing, or simply end-user testing. Now, regulations and GCP require that software systems used in clinical trials be validated and verified. But as entry-level data managers, it's unlikely you'd be responsible for either validation and verification. You should know that it's required and understand the basic flow of the process there. On the other hand, it's very likely you'll be involved in end-user testing or in simple verification tasks. So data management creates and uses a lot of products such as databases, status reports, QC listings, and edit checks. All of these will need to be tested. So you need to understand the basic purpose and principle of testing. What are testing activities? What do you actually test? Well, the list could be endless. Your company should have an SOP on testing to guide you. Make sure you're aware of and following SOPs on testing. But as a general rule of thumb, you want to test anything you're going to use to create, manage, or manipulate the data. So we always test the database. But we also need to test the edit checks we use to review the data, and even the status reports we're going to use to monitor study metrics. Personally, I think you should always test any deliverable. And a deliverable is something you are providing to another group or company. For example, if you're contracted to deliver data sets to the sponsor on a monthly basis, test that output to make sure the data sets include all the required data and that the format therein can be downloaded and used by the recipient. If you're sending a missing pages listing to the site, check to make sure it only includes pages that are actually missing. For example, if the patient terminated at visit 2, the pages for visits 3 through 8 aren't really missing, even if you didn't receive them. They're just no longer expected. These are the sorts of things that you're going to find when you test them. Don't forget that the data review should be focused on the key or critical variables that must be present and correct to support the analysis of the efficacy and safety of your product. Let's review what we learned on previous modules in regards to identifying key variables. Remember, the protocol and the analysis plan will define the primary and secondary efficacy outcome measures as well as the safety variables, which often include adverse event data and may encompass laboratory or other diagnostic values. In addition, there is some data we always consider key, such as demography, because this tells us when the patient started and stopped participating in the trial, and when they stopped and started drug, and if they had serious adverse events, for example, if they died. A quick way to identify the key variables is to simply scan the protocol synopsis and the associated visit schedule or matrix, just like you did when you created your visit matrix for Module 2. Here's a snippet from our CLR Mock 001 protocol synopsis, which shows you where you can find the primary and secondary outcome measures. I'm not going to go in depth into protocol deviations and violations in this course. You're going to be covering these in CLR 430 because monitoring of deviations and violations is a major CRA responsibility. But data managers need to understand what protocol deviations and violations are. Keep in mind that a major component of good clinical practice, or GCP, is adherence to the protocol, and we are all responsible for GCP. Why is it important that we in the site follow the protocol? It's important because the protocol protects the patients in the study and those who may later be taking this product. Remember, the design of the protocol ensures we get the data needed to accurately determine safety and efficacy. Also, the protocol is designed to minimize risk to the test subjects. When we don't follow the protocol, we're basically deviating from it or violating it. Those are the technical terms. These deviations and violations can impact the quality of the data, and they can jeopardize the safety and well-being of the subjects. For example, what if a primary investigator violates the inclusion criteria and includes a patient who is on a medication that is contraindicated for the product you're testing? For example, maybe they are already on a blood thinner and your investigational product is also a blood thinner. Taking both at once might cause the patient to bleed out. Unfortunately for us, the FDA doesn't define what constitutes a violation or a deviation. They just require that we report them to the IRB. Data management is rarely involved with the reporting process. All the same, team members, including data managers, should know what a protocol deviation and a violation is. Because if the data review reveals a trend or pattern of deviations or violations, this needs to be reported to the project team. The project team then needs to identify the root cause of the trend and address it. I want you to understand the difference between a protocol deviation and a protocol violation and be familiar with the terms. There are some commonly accepted industry definitions. The ones on this slide are taken from an article by Norman Goldfarb. I'm assigning the complete article, it's a short one but you need to read it, as part of the module readings. But for now, we're just going to review the definitions. First and foremost, a violation is more serious than a deviation. Deviations are events that don't necessarily have significant consequences, like a patient coming late to a single visit. But violations are things that can have serious consequences, such as enrolling a patient without their informed consent. Let's take a look at how we deal with protocol deviations and violations in our CLR Mock 001 trial. In the image at the top, we see two edit check specifications that relate to protocol violations. The first notes that the pregnancy test must be negative. Remember, the protocol excludes pregnant women in order to protect the fetus. We always worry that our investigational product will cross the placental barrier, causing problems with the fetal development, or that it can cause the woman to miscarriage or abort or develop congenital defects. Allowing a pregnant woman to participate in this trial would be a protocol violation. In the second image, we see that the edit check algorithm number 26 looks for pregnancy equal to 1 or positive. Now, we also know that the protocol says any participant who misses more than 2 oral contraceptive pills in 1 month must discontinue from the study. Again, this is to protect a potential fetus by ensuring a patient does not take study drug and then become pregnant because they've missed the doses. We know pregnancy rises, or the risk of pregnancy rises, if 2 oral contraceptive doses are missed in a 30-day period. If you go back to that edit check specification image at the top, you see that we do have a check that looks for patients who have missed more than 2 doses. In the third image, you can see that edit check number 17 looks for patients who've missed more than those 2 doses and have not been withdrawn from the study. Finally, the image on the bottom is from the study completion form. It notes the non-compliant dose is a reason for withdrawing the patient from the study. So once again, we've closed the loop. We've identified potential violations in the protocol. We've developed our database so that it has the data, captures the data we need to find those violations. We've written edit checks to look for those violations, and we found a way to follow up and see if the violation occurs, if the patient is discontinued as appropriate. When thinking about how you handle deviations and violations, it's important to remember that the overall goal is to prevent them. When we do find deviations and violations, we want to determine if they are one-offs, if they happened only one time, or if there's a chance there could be a trend or pattern. So to do that, we have to determine how they occurred, the root cause, and if we can prevent them occurring in the future. I wanted to include this excellent slide from the University of Cincinnati lecture on preventing deviations and violations. If you read over it, you're going to notice that the emphasis is on an attitude of respect for compliance and, as always, the importance of training. While we're on the topic of prevention, I want to remind you that one of your assigned videos illustrates how Quintiles uses trend analysis in Infusario to identify protocol violation patterns and to address them. So again, the key here is we want to report and acknowledge deviations and violations, but more importantly, we want to examine why they occurred and how we can prevent them from occurring in the future, whether that's a change in the database, the CRF, the protocol, or the training of the site. I wanted to show you some pretty common or standard assumptions that you'll see in most contracts. People are going to want to know the number of patients you expect to screen. And remember, screening is when you meet a patient and just try to figure out if they're even eligible for the study. And then the number of patients who actually are eligible and that you consent and they enroll. The number of unique CRFs, and by this we mean the number of forms that you are going to build a data entry screen for. The total number of CRFs, and that is, let's say you have 15 unique CRFs and 100 patients, you would expect a total of 1,050 case report forms. So total number of CRFs is what you expect to get for all the patients. Non-CRF data to be reconciled. Are you going to have a lot of lab data coming in or IVRS data? Number of serious adverse events, and the number of adverse events. The number of queries per patient, and the number of edit checks you expect to program, the number of monthly and or status reports and how many months you have to send them for, the number of times you need to transfer the database, the duration of the patient screening and enrollment period, because regardless of how many patients you screen and enroll, if you screen 1,000 patients in 1 month or 1,000 patients in 4 months, you're going to have monthly activities that take up additional time for those extra 3 months. The duration of study activities, the same thing. The longer the study is, the more monthly activities that you have to account for. And are you doing things like DSMB? Remember, that's Drug Safety Monitoring Board listings or tables or data sets that you need to account for. Once you know what your budget is, you need to start monitoring it. How do you monitor a budget? First, you make sure, again, you know what tasks are included in the budget and the number of hours estimated for completing them. For projects that are being handled internally, you might not have a contract, but there will still be a set of department metrics that tell you an average of 45 seconds is required to enter a page of data. There might also be indication or project-specific metrics that tell you that for complicated indications like oncology, you might need 60 seconds per page. On the other hand, if you're working as a vendor or CRO, you will definitely have a contract, and your contract will allow you to figure out what metrics are required to meet the budget. You need to be on the lookout as you work on projects for changes in the metrics or your assumptions that are indicators you're going over budget. If you spot this early, it's possible to respond by either negotiating an upcharge, modifying your process, or modifying the deliverables. So let's talk about an upcharge or change order. Essentially, this is where you tell the client that you think there has been a change in your assumptions, and based on that you want to negotiate a change to the budget, and typically you are charging them more for it, so it's referred to as an upcharge. Or you may need to take a look at your process and determine if your process is the reason you're going over budget. For example, could you be generating queries on non-critical data? If so, can you stop generating those queries and bring your metric back in line? Or do you need to review your process and figure other ways that you might be going over budget? Perhaps you need to work with the CRAs to train the sites on ways they can reduce the amount of discrepant data they're entering. So here you are looking at modifying your process as opposed to simply preparing to charge the client more. Perhaps, though, the problem is the number of ad hoc or unbudgeted listings or tasks the client's asking for. The client may not even be aware that what they think of as one-off requests are pushing you over budget. In this case, a project manager may need to explain to the client that they have to restrict the number of ad hoc requests or deliverables they are looking for, or modify the contract to pay for those additional requests.
What are testing activities? What do you actually test? Well, the list could be endless. Your company should have an SOP on testing to guide you. Make sure you're aware of and following the SOPs on testing. But as a general rule of thumb, you want to test anything you're going to use to create, manage, or manipulate the data. So we always test the database. But we also need to test the edit checks we use to review the data, and even the status reports we're going to use to monitor study metrics. Personally, I think you should always test any deliverable. And a deliverable is something you are providing to another group or company. For example, if you're contracted to deliver data sets to the sponsor on a monthly basis, test that output to make sure the data sets include all the required data, and if the format therein can be downloaded and used by the recipient. If you're sending a missing pages listing to the site, check to make sure it only includes pages that are actually missing. For example, if the patient terminated at visit 2, the pages for visits 3 through 8 aren't really missing, even if you didn't receive them. They're just no longer expected. These are the sorts of things that you're going to find when you test that output. We're going to start talking about the document control and data entry instructions now, and I want to insert a little reminder here that project-specific instructions need to be in place before you begin the task. So make sure you have the appropriate signatures or approvals that are required by SOP or by contract, and document that the training on these instructions occurred. Your readings from the textbook have really nice information on additional checks and principles. I'm going to cover just a few of the highlights here. Remember, the goal is to determine that the data was stored in a format that's going to allow it to be analyzed. So, in addition to testing to see if you can enter the data, you have to make sure it's being stored correctly. Are the vital signs data being stored as text or numbers? If a value is 5 digits, are all those digits actually being saved in the database, or are some of them being truncated or deleted? I once worked on a study where the programmer had accidentally limited the size of the file. Every day we entered data into the file, and each night the program deleted all the data over that limit. It took us a week to figure out why our data was disappearing. So you want to make sure your data is being stored the way you think it's going to be stored. How do we test? Well, essentially, your goal is to ensure that the software or process you're testing is working as it should. So one way to do this is to review the specifications that were used to create it. Then create mock data or identify live or real data that meets that specification criteria. Pop it into whatever you're working with, get a printout or listing of the results, review it for errors, provide feedback to the programmer on those errors, review corrected output, and then document the entire process.